She was 22 years old, standing in a town hall full of people who wanted to sell her family, when the doors burst open and three men walked in. Three giants who smelled of pine and gunpowder and the wild places where civilized men feared to go. The biggest one looked at her, looked at the children clinging to her skirts, and said two words that changed everything. How much? This is the story of a mail-order bride, three mountain men, and a love forged in blood and blizzard on the highest ridge of the Wind River Range. The gavel cracked against the oak table like a pistol shot. In the stuffy, dust-choked town hall of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory, a young woman of 22 pulled her trembling siblings tighter against her body and held her breath. The year was 1878, and the world as she knew it was ending in a room that smelled of tobacco smoke and cold indifference. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every single week. And drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. Now let us get back to Eliza Whitfield, because what happened next in that town hall changed everything. Eliza stood in the center aisle of the Bitter Creek Town Hall with the posture of a woman refusing to break even as every bone in her body screamed for her to collapse. She was 22 years old. She had honey blonde hair escaping from a hastily pinned updo, cornflower blue eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights, and a navy traveling dress that was clean but frayed at the cuffs. She was small, barely 5'3", and painfully thin from months of skipping meals so the children could eat. But her spine was iron, her chin was lifted, and there was a fire behind those blue eyes that said very clearly that she would burn this building to the ground before she allowed them to take what was hers. Pressed against her right side stood 12-year-old Caleb, her brother, his fists clenched so tight the knuckles had gone white. He was too thin for his age, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that should have been filling out with the strength of approaching manhood, but instead was being hollowed by hunger. On her left, 9-year-old Rosalie had buried her face in the folds of Eliza's skirt, her silent sobs soaking the fabric in a growing circle of grief. 4-year-old Jonah clung to Eliza's leg with both arms, golden curls pressed against her knee, his wide eyes darting around the room, full of strangers, with the bewildered terror of a child who understood that something terrible was happening, but could not comprehend what. And in the crook of Eliza's arm, 11-month-old Grace slept fitfully against her chest, a warm, fragile weight that Eliza would have died before surrendering. Mayor Cornelius Sloan sat at the raised dais at the front of the hall, a thin hawk of a man in a tailored wool suit that cost more than most families in Bitter Creek earned in 3 months. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles with the deliberate theatrical precision of a man who enjoyed the ceremony of power. He did not look at Eliza. He looked at his ledger. His ledger was his Bible, and the numbers in it were the only gospel he had ever served. "It is a matter of simple mathematics, Miss Whitfield," Sloan declared, his voice carrying through the hall with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Your father, William Whitfield, God rest his soul, owed the Bank of Bitter Creek $600 at the time of his passing. The Whitfield farmstead, consisting of 40 acres of largely unproductive land and one dilapidated structure, has been assessed at a value of $400. The remaining balance of $200 must be settled." He paused, letting the weight of the numbers settle over the room like a burial shroud. "The county cannot afford to maintain 5 orphan dependents on the parish dole. It is therefore the decision of this council that the minor children of the late William Whitfield be placed in suitable Christian homes where they may earn their keep through honest labor and thereby discharge the remaining obligations of the estate." A murmur swept through the packed benches. The town's respectable citizens had turned out for this proceeding the way crows gathered at a carcass. Mrs. Prudence Hargrove, the perpetually sour-faced gossip queen of Bitter Creek, whispered behind her fan, with the particular satisfaction of a woman watching someone else's ruin from a safe distance. Beside her, 2 women nodded along like hens pecking at scattered grain. The blacksmith, a man named Keegan, sat near the front with his thick arms crossed, having already agreed to take Caleb for the forge. The boy was strong enough to pull the bellows, Keegan had said. Strong enough to be useful, as if a 12-year-old boy were a draft horse to be appraised and purchased. Mrs. Hargrove herself had magnanimously volunteered to take Rosalie for domestic work. She called it Christian charity. Eliza knew exactly what it was. She had seen the Hargrove household. She had seen the hollow-eyed girl from the last family that Mrs. Hargrove had taken in scrubbing floors at midnight with cracked and bleeding hands. Charity indeed. The youngest children would be sent to a farming family outside of town, separated, scattered, broken apart like a loaf of bread torn into pieces and tossed to different dogs. "You cannot do this," Eliza said, stepping forward. She was trembling so hard she could barely form words. "You cannot do this, Mayor Sloan. They are my flesh and blood, my brother and sisters. You are ripping a family apart over $200. Her voice cracked on the last word, but beneath the crack was steel. Maternal defiance. The ferocity of a creature protecting its young, regardless of the odds. Sloan finally looked at her. His gaze was the gaze of a man looking at a column of figures that did not add up. "The law is the law, Miss Whitfield. I take no pleasure in this." That was a law, and everyone in the room knew it. Reverend Elijah Pemberton, the town's aging minister, cleared his throat softly from his seat near the dais. He was a kind man, the Reverend with gentle eyes and a weak spine. He knew Sloan was corrupt. He knew this proceeding was an abomination dressed in the language of civic duty, but he lacked the courage to say so. "It is for their own good, Miss Whitfield," Pemberton offered, his voice barely audible. "They will be fed. They will be housed. They will be given honest Christian upbringing." "They will be slaves," Caleb shouted. The boy stepped in front of his sister, with his fists clenched at his sides, his voice breaking somewhere between childhood and the manhood that was being forced upon him far too early. He was shaking, but his eyes burned with the same fire as Eliza's, the same fire as their mother, who had died of scarlet fever when Eliza was 16 and left her eldest daughter to raise the family that she could no longer hold. "You are selling us like cattle," Caleb shouted. "My father would have fought you. My father would have never let you do this." Sloane's gavel slammed down with a crack that made half the room flinch. "Silence the boy, or I will have the sheriff do it." The threat hung in the air like the smell of gunpowder. "Now then, Mr. Keegan has agreed to take the boy for the forge. Mrs. Hargrove will take the older girl for domestic training. The younger children will be placed with the Morrison family on the South Fork Road." Eliza closed her eyes, the world tilted and spun. Baby Grace began to fuss in her arms, disturbed by the tightening of Eliza's grip. Rosalie's sobs grew louder, though still muffled by the fabric of the skirt she pressed her face into, as if by hiding in that small darkness, she could make the world disappear. This was the end. Eliza Whitfield was 22 years old. She had buried her mother at 16. She had buried her father 6 months ago in the frozen ground of a Wyoming winter, digging the grave herself because the ground was too hard and no one in Bitter Creek would help without payment she did not have. For 6 months after that, she had fought with every weapon available to a penniless young woman on the frontier. She had laundered shirts for the saloon until her hands cracked and bled. She had mended harnesses for the livery stable until her eyes burned. She had skipped every other meal, sometimes every 2 out of 3, so that the children could eat. And in the pocket of her navy dress, pressed against her hip like a secret talisman, was a letter. A letter she had received 3 months ago in response to an advertisement she had answered in the Rocky Mountain Gazette. An advertisement that read, "Capable God, fearing woman of good character, sought for mountain homestead. Hard life, fair arrangement. Reply to J. Hartwell, Wind River Range, Wyoming Territory." She had written back. He had written again. His letters were sparse and elegant, the handwriting surprisingly refined for a man who lived above the timberline. "The winters are hard, but the cabin is warm. There is room enough. Come in the spring." She had planned to go. She had planned to take the children and ride west into the mountains and start again. But Sloan had moved faster. And now, standing in the center aisle of the Bitter Creek Town Hall, watching the instruments of her family's destruction being arranged with the cold efficiency of a banker's ledger, Eliza prepared to do the only thing she had left. She would throw herself at Sloan's feet. She would beg. She would offer herself to whatever grueling labor they demanded, her body, her freedom, her future, everything, if they would just let her keep her family together. She opened her mouth to speak. That was when the doors burst open. The heavy oak doors at the back of the town hall did not simply open. They exploded inward on their iron hinges, admitting a howling autumn wind that tore through the room like a living thing. Papers flew from Sloan's desk and scattered across the floor. 2 oil lamps guttered and died, plunging the rear of the hall into sudden shadow. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in a heartbeat, and in the threshold, silhouetted against the sky bruised purple and red by the dying afternoon sun, stood three men. The silence that fell over the Bitter Creek Town Hall was not the silence of surprise. It was the silence of prey recognizing predators. The instinctive, ancient quiet that descends upon a herd when wolves appear on the ridgeline. Three men, three giants. The first man through the door was the largest. He stood well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with a chest as wide as a barn door, and arms that looked capable of splitting a log with a single blow. A heavy bear-hide coat made him look twice his natural size, which was already formidable enough to make the sheriff's hand drift toward his holstered revolver. A thick, dark chestnut beard obscured the lower half of his face, but above the beard, a jagged, pale scar cut a vicious path across his left cheekbone, disappearing into his hairline near the temple. His eyes were the most striking thing about him. They were the color of storm clouds, a piercing, unsettling gray that swept the room in a single pass and then locked with absolute precision onto Eliza Whitfield and the children huddled around her. This was Josiah Hartwell, 33 years old, former soldier, survivor of the Battle of Shiloh, where he had watched boys younger than Caleb die screaming in the mud. Trapper prospector and the eldest of three brothers who lived above the timberline of the Wind River Range and came down to civilization only twice a year, trailing the wild behind them like a scent. The second man entered on Josiah's right flank. He was leaner than his brother, but no less tall, 6'5", with the wiry, sinewy build of a man who spent his days tracking animals across miles of trackless wilderness. His hair was dark blonde, streaked with gold by the sun, and his eyes were a striking amber that seemed to catch and hold the lamplight. A faded rope burn scar wrapped around his right forearm like a bracelet carved from old pain. His hand rested casually on the stock of a long Winchester rifle slung across his back. He said nothing. He did not need to. His silence spoke for him. This was Micah Hartwell, 30 years old. The quietest of the three brothers, a man who could sit motionless for hours watching a deer trail and communicate more with a single look than most men could say in a paragraph. He swept the room with those amber eyes in one comprehensive assessment, cataloging exits, threats, weapons, and the position of every person, and then he was done. He had learned everything he needed to know. The third man entered last. He was the youngest and the most human-looking of the three. His hair was lighter brown, tousled and sun-lightened, and his face, while bearing the same rugged Hartwell bones, carried a warmth that his brothers' faces did not. There was the ghost of a smirk at the corner of his mouth, the faint suggestion of a man who found the world amusing even when it was trying to kill him. But when his eyes landed on the children pressed against Eliza's skirts, the smirk vanished, replaced by something harder, something older, something protective. This was Levi Hartwell, 27 years old, the youngest brother, the one whose birth had killed their mother, a guilt he carried beneath his easy grin like a stone sewn into the lining of his coat. He was the bridge between his brothers and the world, the one who laughed when there was nothing to laugh at, but the one who kept the darkness at bay with humor and restless energy. The three of them filled the doorway and then the aisle, walking toward the front of the hall with the synchronized, unhurried pace of men who had spent their lives moving through dangerous country together. Their boots, heavy mud-caked, struck the pine boards in a rhythm that sounded like a war drum. The crowd parted for them pulling back skirts, shifting chairs, pressing themselves deeper into the benches. Mrs. Hargrove looked like she had swallowed a live fish. Josiah stopped a few feet from Eliza. He looked down at her. He towered over her by more than a foot, this mountain of a man in his bear-hide coat, smelling of pine needles, wood smoke, and the cold, untamed earth of the high country. He took in her pallor, her exhaustion, the fierce, terrified tilt of her chin, and the four children clinging to her as if she were the last solid ground in a flooding river. He did not speak to her. Not yet. He turned his massive frame toward the dais, where Cornelius Sloan sat frozen behind his ledger spectacles, slightly askew, gavel still clutched in one hand. How much? Josiah's voice was deep, scraping the air like two stones grinding together. It was not a question that invited negotiation. It was a demand wrapped in the shape of an inquiry. Sloan blinked, his composure, so carefully maintained throughout the proceedings, cracked like thin ice. I beg your pardon, Mr. Hartwell. How much is the debt? $200. But this is a matter of civic responsibility, and the welfare of the children, and the council has already decided that the proper course of action is to ensure that suitable arrangements are made for the responsible placement of the minor dependents in accordance with the statutory obligations of the territory, and Josiah reached inside his bear hide coat. He pulled out a heavy, worn leather pouch, the kind that trappers and prospectors used to carry their season's earnings down from the mountains. He stepped up to the mayor's table, untied the leather strings with thick, calloused fingers, and upended the pouch. Gold. Raw, glittering Wind River gold cascaded out of the leather pouch and clattered against the surface of Sloane's desk. Nuggets the size of acorns, heavy flakes that caught the lamplight and threw it back in sharp yellow sparks, a stream of pure mountain wealth that pooled on the mayor's ledger and covered his neat columns of figures in a tide of gleaming metal. There was easily $500 worth of gold sitting on that desk. More money than most people in Bitter Creek would see in a year. More money than William Whitfield had owed in his entire miserable, manipulated life. The gasp that went through the room was loud enough to hear above the wind still howling through the open doors. "That clears it," Josiah said. It was not a question. Sloane stared at the gold. His eyes behind their wire-rimmed spectacles went wide and then narrow with a speed that revealed exactly what kind of man he was. Greed warred with control. Desire warred with authority. He wanted the gold. He wanted it badly. But he also wanted something else, something the gold could not buy. He wanted the children. He wanted the cheap labor they represented. He wanted the power of controlling another family's fate. And he was not about to let a mountain man walk in and take that from him. "Mr. Hartwell," Sloane said, recovering some of his composure, though his voice had climbed half an octave, "you cannot simply purchase a family. This is a civilized proceeding in a civilized town. The debt is one matter, but the destitution of the guardian is quite another. Miss Whitfield has no home. She has no means of support. She has no husband. The council has determined that the children require stable, supervised Christian households, and the mere discharge of a monetary obligation does not address the fundamental question of their welfare and continued care. I will take her," Josiah said, "and every one of her brothers and sisters. They come with me and my brothers to the ridge." Behind him, Micah shifted his weight slightly, his hand adjusting on the Winchester rifle. Not threatening, ready. Levi crossed his arms over his broad chest and planted his feet a wall of muscle and defiance that dared anyone in the room to object. "Preposterous!" Mrs. Hargrove shrieked from her bench, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a saw through green wood. "Three unmarried men taking a young unmarried woman and four impressionable children up to God knows where in those mountains, it is scandalous. It is immoral. It is an affront to every decent Christian in this community." Josiah turned his head slowly. He fixed the gossiping woman with a stare so cold, so utterly devoid of warmth or patience that she snapped her mouth shut, as if he had reached across the room and clamped it closed with his hand. The silence that followed was suffocating. Reverend Pemberton stepped forward, his hands clasped nervously in front of his black coat. "Mr. Hartwell, Mrs. Hargrove for once speaks true. It violates the decency of this community for a man and a woman to cohabitate without the sanctity of marriage, especially with children present. The law may not care, but the Lord most certainly does." Josiah stood in silence for a long, agonizing moment. The entire town hall held its breath. Eliza could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel the four small bodies pressed against hers vibrating with fear and desperate hope. Then Josiah looked at her. He turned from the dais and looked down at Eliza Whitfield, meeting her eyes for the first time with full, direct, intentional contact. His storm-gray eyes searched her face. She met his gaze and refused to look away. Though her knees were trembling so badly, she was not certain they would continue to hold her weight. In his eyes, she did not see lust. She did not see cruelty. She did not see the cold transactional calculation of a man purchasing livestock. She saw something she could not quite name, something that lived deeper than words, a recognition, perhaps. As if he were seeing something in her that he had not expected to find, as if she had surprised him simply by being exactly who she was. Then Josiah's voice dropped, low enough that only Eliza, his brothers, and the children could hear. "I will not force this, Miss Whitfield. You wrote to me of your own will. You know what I offered in those letters. A roof, a hearth, a home for your family. My brothers and I will protect you and yours. But I will not drag you to the altar like livestock at auction. The choice is yours." And there it was, in the middle of the worst moment of her life, in a room full of people who wanted to sell her family to the highest bidder, a man she had never met was giving her the one thing no one else in Bitter Creek had offered her in 6 months of desperate survival: a choice. Eliza looked at Caleb, angry, scared, trying with everything he had to be brave enough for all of them. She looked at Rosalie, whose silent tears had soaked through the navy fabric of her skirt. She looked at Jonah, 4 years old, golden curls, gap-toothed smile now replaced by wide-eyed terror clinging to her leg, because she was the only safe thing left in his world. She looked at baby Grace asleep against her chest, breathing softly, unaware of the storm. She looked back at Josiah Hartwell. "I choose my family," Eliza whispered her to. "Marry us." "Then marry us," Josiah said to the Reverend. The gasp that went through the townspeople of Bitter Creek was loud enough to drown out the wind. The wedding took exactly 4 minutes. It was the most surreal, joyless ceremony in the history of the Wyoming Territory. There were no flowers, there was no music, there was no celebration. Eliza stood at the front of the hall with a sleeping baby on her chest and 3 frightened children at her feet, her voice a hollow whisper as she repeated vows she had never imagined speaking to a stranger. Josiah stood beside her, towering over her like a mountain standing beside a wildflower, smelling of pine and wood smoke and wet earth. When Reverend Pemberton pronounced them man and wife, Josiah did not kiss her. He simply nodded once, a single definitive motion that said, "It is done." "Gather your things," Josiah said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "We lose the light in 3 hours." Micah stepped forward and scooped the remaining gold from Sloane's desk, dropping it back into the leather pouch with efficient movements. He locked eyes with the mayor for exactly 1 second. The message required no words. "We paid. We are done. Do not follow." Levi, to the astonishment of everyone watching, knelt down in front of 4-year-old Jonah, who was staring up at the 3 enormous men with eyes the size of silver dollars. Levi offered a lopsided grin, the kind of smile that transformed his rugged face into something almost gentle. "Hey there, little man. You like horses?" Jonah nodded, too terrified and too fascinated to speak. "Good. We have got mules. They are uglier, but a whole lot smarter. Want to ride up front?" For the first time in hours, a tiny ghost of a smile flickered across Jonah's face. Eliza watched this exchange, and something shifted inside her chest. A crack in the wall of pure terror. Within the hour, the Hartwell wagon was loaded and rolling out of Bitter Creek. Eliza sat on the hard wooden seat of a massive buckboard wagon, wedged between Josiah, who drove the team of 2 draft mules named Buster and Belle, and the vast, indifferent Wyoming sky. Her entire life was packed into 2 worn leather trunks and a burlap sack, sitting in the wagon bed alongside 50 pounds of flour coffee beans, winter ammunition, and 3 months of supplies. Micah rode alongside on a tall, rangy bay horse, his amber eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines and tree lines for threats that the civilized world had forgotten existed. Levi sat in the wagon bed with the children, already entertaining Jonah with a ridiculous story about a bear who could not find his own cave. Caleb sat near the tailgate, glaring daggers at the back of Josiah's head, silently appointing himself the protector of his sister and siblings. He did not trust these men. He did not trust anyone. Trust had gotten his family nothing but a dead father and a pile of debt. Rosalie held baby Grace and pointed out the ravens circling overhead, naming them, giving them stories, doing what she always did when the world became too frightening. She retreated into the quiet country of her imagination, where things could be shaped and ordered and made beautiful. Eliza did not look back at Bitter Creek as the wagon rolled down the main street and past the last weathered building at the edge of town. There was nothing left for her there but a shallow grave in the cemetery, in a town full of people who had been willing to sell her family for $200. The journey up into the Wind River Range was a punishing ascent that began the moment the flat roads of the plains ended and the real Wyoming began. The dusty, rutted trails gave way to rocky, winding paths carved into the sides of steep inclines that made the wagon creak and groan like a living thing in pain. As they climbed higher, the air grew noticeably thinner, colder, sharper. The sparse sagebrush of the valley floor was replaced by towering lodgepole pines and ancient blue spruces that blocked out the late afternoon sun and cast the trail into deep, creeping shadows that seemed to move when you were not looking at them directly. Hawks circled overhead in lazy spirals. A distant elk bugled a sound so alien to Eliza's ears that she flinched. The wind carried the smell of pine resin and cold granite and something older, something wild, something that did not care whether she lived or died. Eliza shivered and pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. She glanced sideways at her new husband. Josiah drove the team with quiet, effortless competence, his massive hands holding the leather reins, loosely guiding the mules over treacherous rocks and washed-out gullies with the precision of a man who had traveled this trail 1,000 times and knew every stone by name. He had not spoken a word to her since they left town. "Josiah," Eliza finally said. Her voice trembled from the cold and from the sheer magnitude of her situation. She was married. She was on a mountain. She was heading into wilderness with 3 men she did not know, and the only evidence she had that she had not made the worst decision of her life was a handful of letters signed with a name she had learned to trust on paper but had never tested in the flesh. "I need you to know something," she said, and her voice found its edge. The edge that had kept her alive in Bitter Creek. The edge that had fed 4 children on a laundress's wages. "I am grateful for what you did today. You saved my family, but I am not property, and neither are they. I am your wife in name, but I will not be your servant, your plaything, or your prisoner. And if you or either of your brothers lay a hand on those children in anger, or on me, I will put a bullet in you while you sleep. All 3 of you." The threat hung in the frigid mountain air. It was a bluff born of absolute desperation, spoken by a woman who had never fired a gun in her life. But she meant every word, and something in the way she said it made it clear that she would find a way to make good on the promise if the need arose. Josiah slowly turned his head to look at her. The scar on his cheek seemed to glow pale in the fading light. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch touched the corner of his mouth beneath the thick beard. It might have been amusement. It might have been respect. It might have been both. "I bought your debts, Eliza," he said quietly. "I did not buy you." He spoke in spare, blunt sentences, the way a man speaks who has spent years communicating more with silence than with words. He needed help at the cabin. Winter was coming, and it was going to be a hard one. He and his brother spent weeks at a time running trap lines across dozens of miles of mountain territory. Last winter, Josiah had caught a fever and nearly died because there was no one to keep the fire stoked or fetch water or cook a meal. They needed someone to manage the homestead while they worked the wilderness. Eliza needed a roof over her head and food for her family. The arrangement was practical. "And the marriage?" she asked, her chest tight. "A piece of paper," Josiah replied, "to keep the town from riding up here with the torches and pitchforks. You have your bed, I have mine." From his horse, Micah rode up alongside the wagon and spoke without looking at Eliza. It was the most words he had said all day. "The cabin has 3 rooms and a loft. You and the young ones take the main room. Josiah sleeps in the east lean-to. I take the loft when I am not on the trap line. Levi has got a separate bunk in the barn quarters. You will have more privacy than a nun in a convent." Eliza looked at him surprised. He met her gaze for exactly 1 second, his amber eyes unreadable, and then he rode ahead without another word. From the wagon bed, Levi called out, his voice carrying the unmistakable warmth of a man who found levity even in the jaws of uncertainty. "And I do most of the cooking, so you might actually be saving us from ourselves. Last week, Josiah made a stew that tasted like it died twice." Even Caleb, angry, suspicious, determined to hate everything about the situation, could not entirely suppress a snort. They reached the plateau as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and bruised red. The temperature plummeted. Just as little Jonah began to cry from the biting cold, the trees parted, and Eliza saw it. She had expected a crude, drafty hovel, a dirt floor shack smelling of animal grease, and the sour loneliness of men who had forgotten how to live among other people. What she saw in the dying twilight made her breath catch. The cabin was enormous. Constructed of massive, tightly fitted, hand-hewn cedar logs, it sat against the granite face of a towering cliff that sheltered it from the worst of the northern winds. The roof was pitched steep to shed heavy winter snow covered in thick cedar shakes that overlapped like the scales of some great sleeping beast. A sturdy stone chimney ran up the side, and smoke was already curling lazily from the top, the sign of a banked fire waiting inside for someone to breathe it back to life. To the right stood a robust barn, a woodshed stacked 10 feet high with precisely split logs, and a spring house built over a running creek whose water was so clear it looked like liquid glass. A large fenced corral held 3 horses and space for the mules. Beyond the corral, the dark timber stretched up toward the granite peaks, and the air was so clean it almost burned. This was not a temporary camp. This was not the shelter of a man passing through. This was a fortress built by hands that understood the mountain and intended to stay. Built by Angus Hartwell over 15 years and maintained by his 3 sons in the 5 years since his death, it was built to withstand blizzards, wolves, and the end of the world itself. Josiah helped Eliza down from the wagon. His massive hands spanned her waist for just a second, steadying her, and then he stepped back. He did not linger. "Take them inside." Doors unlocked. Eliza gathered the children, wrapping a heavy blanket around Jonah and Grace, and ushered Caleb and Rosalie toward the heavy oak door. She pushed it open and stepped inside, bracing herself for the worst. The interior was dark, illuminated only by the glowing embers in a massive stone hearth that could have held a man standing upright. The air was dry and smelled of seasoned wood, dried herbs, and old leather. And it was clean, immaculately, surprisingly, almost impossibly clean. There were no piles of refuse, no rotting food, no sour smell of neglect. The floors were thick, polished pine boards. A large, heavy wooden table sat in the center of the room with a bench on one side and 2 sturdy chairs on the other. A cast iron stove stood in the cooking corner, well maintained and recently cleaned. On the far wall, a large bed covered in thick quilts and furs occupied a space that felt almost sacred in its warmth and solidity. Bundles of dried sage and mint hung from the rafters, filling the air with a subtle, clean fragrance. And on the wall near the hearth, a beautiful Shoshone blanket hung like a piece of art, its colors faded by time but still vibrant enough to catch the eye. "It is nice," Rosalie whispered, her wide eyes taking in every detail with the cataloging precision of a born artist. Josiah entered a moment later carrying 2 heavy sacks of supplies. He struck a match on the stone fireplace and lit 2 oil lamps, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow that chased away the shadows and the fear, at least for the moment. He walked to the hearth, tossed in kindling and a small log, and blew on the embers. Within seconds, a cheerful fire roared to life, filling the cabin with warmth that soaked into Eliza's cold bones like a benediction. "The big bed is yours," Josiah said, pointing to the far wall. "You and the girls." He gestured to a loft accessible by a sturdy wooden ladder. "The boy can sleep up there." Then he pointed to a heavy door near the back of the cabin. "I sleep in the lean-to." "You are giving up your bed?" Eliza asked. Josiah avoided her eyes. "Cannot have a mother and babies freezing on the floor," he said, and the word he used, mother, hit Eliza in a place she had not expected. Because she was not their mother. She was their sister. But she had been their mother in every way that mattered for 2 years, and this man, this stranger, this mountain had seen that in her without being told. Levi entered carrying more supplies and struck up the fire in the cooking stove. Micah set a cloth-wrapped bundle on the table. "Smoked venison and hardtack. Eat. There is dried apple in the larder for the young ones." He paused, then added, almost grudgingly, those last 5 words, as if kindness were a language he understood but rarely chose to speak. Within 30 minutes, Eliza had taken over the kitchen. She found the larder stocked with basics: flour, salt, coffee, dried beans, cured bacon. She found the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. And she produced a simple but hot meal venison stew, thickened with flour cornbread, cooked in a skillet, and strong black coffee that filled the cabin with a smell so warm and so human that it softened the edges of everything. The first dinner was a fragile thing. 9 people around a table built for fewer, the geography of seating negotiated in silence. Josiah sat at the head, Micah to his right, Levi to his left. Eliza and the children filled the bench at the opposite end. Jonah sat next to Levi, chattering about the mules, entirely unaware that he was the only person in the room who was not afraid. Baby Grace slept in a cradle that Josiah had wordlessly produced from the lean to a beautiful piece of carved cedar that was clearly not new. Eliza noticed this and said nothing. She wondered whose baby this cradle had been built for. The answer she suspected would come later, and it would not be a happy story. After the children were drowsy and settled, an uncomfortable silence descended. Micah broke it not with words but with action. He stood, walked to the larder, returned with a small tin of dried apple slices, and placed it on the table near the children. Then he sat back down. Thank you, Eliza said. One barely perceptible nod. That was all. Josiah was the last to leave. He stood at the door of the east, leaned to one massive hand on the frame, and looked back at Eliza and the children settling into the big bed. The bolt on the front door is heavy, he said. Push it all the way until it clicks. The back door latches from inside only. He paused, then so quietly she almost missed it. You are safe here, Eliza, my word on it. He closed the door. Eliza stared at it for a long moment, then walked to the front door and pushed the heavy iron bolt until it clicked. The first 2 weeks on the mountain were a delicate, tense dance of strangers learning to orbit each other without collision. 5 adults and 4 children in sharing a space that had been exclusively male territory for more than 2 decades. Josiah maintained distance. He left before dawn and returned after dark, spending his days chopping wood, repairing traps, reinforcing the barn, and hunting. He was polite, but minimal. Thank you. Good morning. Past the salt, the barest scaffolding of domesticity. But small details appeared that betrayed the man beneath the granite. Every morning, Eliza found a fresh stack of kindling by the stove, cut smaller than Josiah's usual size, perfect for the cooking fire. A new wooden peg rack appeared by the door overnight, carved with care for the children's coats. He never mentioned these things. She never thanked him aloud, but they both knew. Micah remained the skeptic, watching the family with the patient, assessing eye of a man who judged the world by observing it rather than questioning it. But he was fair. When Eliza made mistakes salting the jerky cure too heavily using the wrong wood for the smoking shed, he corrected her without cruelty. And slowly a sign of trust emerged that only Eliza recognized for what it was. Micah began leaving his prized skinning knives on the table for her to use in the kitchen. From Micah Hartwell, that was practically a blood oath. Levi was the bridge. The first to laugh, the first to tell a story at dinner, the first to ask Eliza about her life before Bitter Creek. He drew the children out of their shells with natural ease, carving wooden animals for Jonah, teaching Rosalie to identify animal tracks, coaxing words out of Caleb by discussing the mechanics of trap setting as if the boy were his equal. But it was little Jonah who broke the first real wall. One evening, as Josiah sat by the fire carving a new handle for an axe, the 4-year-old escaped Eliza's watchful eye and wandered over to the enormous man. He stood by Josiah's knee, watching the wood shavings fall, with fascinated eyes, utterly unafraid, in the way that only very young children can be, because they have not yet learned to recognize the things that should frighten them. Josiah stopped carving. He looked down at the tiny boy who barely reached his knee. Something cracked behind those storm-gray eyes, something that had been sealed shut for years. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, roughly carved wooden horse. He held it out. Jonah took it. His face exploded into a gap-toothed grin that could have melted granite, and in that cabin on the mountain in the firelight it did. "Thank you, giant," Jonah said. Josiah made a sound that Eliza, watching from the kitchen corner with her heart in her throat, realized was a chuckle. A real, genuine chuckle. The first she had heard from this man. "You are welcome, little man." And the mountain felt for the first time in many years a little less cold. That same week, Caleb began shadowing Micah outside. The boy chose the silent brother, not the intimidating eldest, and not the friendly youngest, because Caleb did not trust intimidation, and he did not trust friendliness. He trusted competence. And Micah was the most competent man he had ever seen. Micah found the boy trying to track a rabbit in the frozen mud and making a mess of it. He did not say a word. He simply knelt beside Caleb and pointed to a set of tracks, then another, then a third. He showed the boy the difference between a rabbit moving slowly and a rabbit running, the splay of the toes, the depth of the print, the spacing between leaps. He taught him to read the language of the earth itself. Caleb absorbed it like a sponge. For the first time since his father died, the anger in the boy's eyes was replaced by something else: focus, skill, purpose. At the end of the lesson, Micah gave a single curt nod, the highest form of approval he knew how to give. That evening, Caleb told Eliza, "Micah is not so bad. He does not talk much, but he knows things." And Rosalie found her moment with Levi when he glanced over her shoulder at her drawing pad and stopped dead, genuinely stunned by what the 9-year-old had created. She had drawn the homestead in remarkable detail, and she had drawn the 3 brothers, each one captured with an accuracy that revealed not just what they looked like, but who they were. "You drew that," Levi asked, his voice stripped of its usual humor, replaced by something closer to reverence. You have got real talent, Rosalie. Next supply run, I am trading for proper charcoal and drawing paper. Talent like this deserves to be fed. Rosalie smiled, her first real smile since their father died, and Levi felt something tighten in his chest, something he could not name, but it had the shape of family. One evening, with the children asleep and the fire burning low, Eliza stepped onto the porch and found all three brothers sitting in the cool night air. Levi patted the step beside him. Come on out, the mountain is showing off tonight. She sat. The silence was comfortable. A first. I want to understand something, Eliza said carefully. Why the advertisement? Why now? Levi spoke first. Pa built this place for a family. When Ma died birthing me, it became less of a home and more of a base camp. Pa raised us to be mountain men, but he forgot to raise us to be human beings. Micah added in his sparse way, last winter was bad. Josiah caught the fever. I was 3 days out on the trap line. By the time I got back, he was half dead by the fire. One more day, and I would have been burying my brother. Josiah spoke last, his voice low and rough. I spent 10 years convincing myself I did not need anyone. The fever taught me I was wrong. A man alone on a mountain is just waiting to die. The vulnerability of that admission from the most guarded of the three shifted something in Eliza that she would never be able to shift back. She saw them clearly for the first time. Not three intimidating giants. Three lonely men who had lost their mother, lost their father, and were slowly losing themselves in the silence of the mountains. Well, Eliza said softly, you are not alone anymore. The silence that followed was warm, and for the first time since she had stepped off the wagon into the unknown, Eliza Whitfield Hartwell felt something she had not felt in over a year. She felt like she might be home, but she did not know what was coming. She did not know about the blizzard that would descend on the mountain like the wrath of Shaw, or the wolves that would come howling out of the darkness, or the blood that would soak the cabin floor. She did not know that the man sleeping in the lean-to would nearly die in her arms, and that she would stitch him back together with nothing but a curved needle, raw whiskey, and the stubborn refusal to let the mountain take one more person from her. And she did not know about the secret buried in the false bottom of her father's trunk. The secret that would bring Cornelia Sloan back up the mountain with hired guns and burning torches ready to destroy everything she had built. But all of that was still to come. Tonight the fire was warm. The children were safe. And somewhere in the lean, to a man who had not slept peacefully in 7 years, listened to the sound of a family breathing in the next room and felt something he barely recognized anymore. Hope. The first Sunday on the mountain, Eliza did something that none of the Hartwell brothers expected. She opened her mother's Bible, the one possession she had carried from Pennsylvania to Wyoming, without ever setting down, and she read aloud. It was not a sermon. It was not a lecture. It was simply a woman's clear musical voice filling a cabin that had not heard such a sound in 27 years, reading the story of Ruth to a room full of people who needed to hear it, whether they knew it or not. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. The first Sunday, only Rosalie and Jonah sat close to listen. Caleb lurked in the loft, pretending he was not paying attention. Levi sat at the table carving a wooden wolf, his hands busy but his ears open. By the third Sunday, the entire household had gathered without being asked. Micah appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, leaning against the frame. And Josiah, who had initially dismissed the practice as parlor nonsense, sat in his chair by the fire with his massive hands folded in his lap and his storm-gray eyes fixed on the woman reading. The words hung in the warm air. Josiah's eyes met Eliza's across the room. Neither looked away. Something was changing on the mountain. Something quiet and slow, like the turning of seasons, like the thawing of frozen ground. Meanwhile, far below in Bitter Creek, a lean, sharp-eyed man in a bowler hat rode into town on a tired horse. He checked into the boarding house, asked the innkeeper casual questions about the local businesses, the bank, and a man named William Whitfield. The innkeeper, happy to gossip, told him everything. The dead farmer, the orphaned children, the 3 mountain men who had swept into the town hall with gold and thunder and taken the whole family up into the Wind River Range. The stranger wrote something in a small leather notebook. He tipped his hat. Much obliged. He signed the register with a careful hand. A. Brennan. On the mountain, the weeks passed and the walls continued to crack. It happened in small ways. A carved boxwood comb appeared on the table beside Eliza's coffee cup one morning, intricate and beautiful with no note and no explanation. She recognized the carving style, the same hands that had made Jonah's wooden horse. She looked at Josiah, who was putting on his coat with studied concentration, refusing to meet her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "It is beautiful." He grunted something unintelligible and walked out the door, and Levi, watching from the kitchen corner, had to bite his fist to keep from laughing because the tips of his eldest brother's ears had gone red beneath his hat. Josiah taught Eliza to handle the Winchester 1873 lever-action rifle. He stood behind her, his hands guiding her stance, adjusting her shoulder, closing her fingers around the stock. Every point of contact burned. "Again," Josiah said, his voice rougher than usual. "Your aim pulls left. Plant your back foot." She fired. The bullet struck the target. Better. One word. From Josiah Hartwell, it was a sonnet. And one night, by the dying fire, after the children and the other brothers had retired to their separate quarters, Josiah told Eliza about Morning Star. He spoke in a low, measured voice, each word dragged from somewhere deep and long-sealed. She was Shoshone. She was brave and fierce, and she had made the mountain feel less like exile and more like home. "She was carrying our child when the cholera came," Josiah said. "I buried them both under the big pine by the East Ridge. I visit them when the snow melts." Eliza listened without interrupting, without judging, without offering the empty comforts that people offer when they do not know what else to say. When he finished, she reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His massive fingers closed around hers gently, as if she were made of something that might break. "Thank you for telling me," she said. They sat like that, hand in hand, watching the last embers pulse and fade. It was the most intimate moment of their marriage, and it required nothing more than honesty and two hands holding on. The fragile piece of the mountain shattered on the evening of the third week. The sky bruised an ugly, violent purple by mid-afternoon. The wind did not howl, it screamed. The first major blizzard of the season arrived early, and it arrived with the fury of something that had been waiting. The brothers reacted with the practiced urgency of men who had survived storms that killed lesser people. Josiah hauled a freshly killed buck from the tree line, his beard coated in ice. Micah secured every board and latch of the barn. Levi brought the chickens into the woodshed, carried armloads of firewood inside, and filled every container with water from the spring before it froze solid. Eliza barred the windows and wrapped the children in every fur and blanket the cabin held. By nightfall, the cabin was shaking. Snow piled against the windows, sealing them in a tomb of white. The fire roared in the hearth, and the family huddled together in its warmth, listening to the storm rage outside like a living thing trying to claw its way in. Then a sound pierced through the howling wind that turned Josiah's face to stone. A frantic, high-pitched braying from the barn. The mules, followed by a chorus of chilling, chaotic howls that rose and fell like the voices of the damned. "Timber wolves," Josiah said. "Big pack, driven down by the storm. They are going for the barn." The three brothers exchanged a single look, the wordless, instantaneous communication of men who had survived together for decades. Josiah spoke first. "I take the front. Micah the east side." He looked at Levi. "You stay here." "Like hell I stay. You stay with them." Josiah's voice left no room for argument. "If we do not come back, you get them down the mountain." The weight of that order silenced the cabin. Levi's jaw clenched, but he nodded. He understood. If the worst happened, someone had to survive to protect the family. Eliza grabbed Josiah's arm. The contact shocked them both. "You cannot go out there. You will freeze. You will not see a foot in front of you." Josiah looked down at her hand on his arm. Something flickered in his gray eyes, a crack in the granite. "If we lose the mules, we lose our haul to the trading post. If we lose the barn, we lose the feed. If the roof caves, we die up here, Eliza. I have to go." He pulled his arm gently from her grasp. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anything unless you hear my voice." He and Micah stepped out into the swirling white abyss, and the wind slammed the door shut behind them. The next hour was the longest of Eliza Whitfield's life. She stood by the door with her hands pressed flat against the cold oak, listening. Levi paced like a caged animal, twin colts drawn knuckles white. Caleb stood at the loft ladder, pale but steady. Rosalie held Jonah and Grace on the bed, whispering stories to cover the sounds of the storm. Over the roar of the blizzard, muffled and distant, the thunderous cracks of rifle fire. Josiah's heavy sharps, a cannon blast that shook the air even through walls and wind. Micah's Winchester, sharper, faster. One shot, two, five, seven. Then horrible, agonizing silence. Eliza stared at the door. Her lips moved without sound. Please, come back, both of you. Do not leave us alone up here. Do not leave me alone. She realized in the terrifying silence of the storm that she no longer feared the mountain man. She feared for him, and that terrified her most of all. A heavy thud struck the door. Then Micah's voice, tight and stripped of its usual calm. Open it, Josiah is down. Levi ripped the bolt back. The wind shrieked. Blinding snow drove into the cabin. Micah staggered through the doorway, half carrying, half dragging his eldest brother. Josiah was barely conscious, his bare-hide coat torn to ribbons along the left side. The thick wool shirt beneath was soaked in a dark spreading stain that looked black in the lamplight. The copper stench of blood hit Eliza like a fist. The alpha wolf, a 200-pound monster, had gotten behind Josiah while he was reloading the single-shot sharps. It had clamped its jaws just above his hip and torn through muscle and flesh before Micah put a bullet through its skull at point-blank range. I got 7 left, Micah reported, lowering Josiah to the floor. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Buster is dead. The wolves got the mule before we reached the barn. Belle is alive. The pack scattered after I killed the alpha, but they will come back if they smell blood. Eliza dropped to her knees. She stripped back the shredded coat and looked at the wound. It was gruesome, jagged, and it was bleeding with the steady persistence of something that intended to kill. I need boiled water whiskey from the larder and the medical kit from the shelf, she said, and her voice found the same sharp, commanding edge that had kept 4 children alive on a laundress's wages. Oh, bombs. She looked at Micah. Can you sew hide? I can. Then you will assist me. Levi, keep the children in the loft. Caleb, stoke the fire. Rosalie, boil every clean cloth you can find. Josiah's eyes fluttered open, storm gray, clouded with pain. You have to sew it, Eliza. He rasped. Curved needle, silk thread, in my kit. His massive hand gripped her wrist with surprising strength. Pour the whiskey first. Do not let me bleed out in front of the young ones. Eliza's stomach heaved. She had stitched torn breeches and mended grain sacks. She had never sutured human flesh. She looked at the blood pooling on the floorboards and then at Caleb, who was staring at the wound, trembling. Caleb, I need you to hold his legs down, she said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Rosalie, bring the whiskey and boil water now. Josiah bit down on a strip of leather harness as Eliza poured raw Kentucky bourbon directly into the open wound. His body convulsed, lifting off the floor. Micah threw his weight across his brother's shoulders, pinning him down. Josiah's growl of agony vibrated through the floorboards. Eliza threaded the curved needle with trembling, blood-slicked fingers. Her hands shook so badly she could barely see what she was doing. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry. Do it, Josiah grunted through the leather. She pierced the skin. She stitched with the same desperate, pragmatic focus she had used to keep her family alive in Bitter Creek, pushing the horror aside, pushing the fear aside, pushing everything aside except the needle and the flesh and the absolute refusal to let this man die on her cabin floor. Beside her, Micah steadied the wound edges with his tracker's hands. And in that terrible hour, the silent brother and the mail-order bride worked together with a precision born of pure necessity. 18 jagged, ugly stitches pulled the torn flesh back together. By the time she tied the final knot, Eliza was drenched in sweat, her navy dress was stained crimson from collar to hem, and Josiah had passed out from the pain. Micah looked at her across his brother's unconscious body. For the first time, something unmistakable burned in his amber eyes. Not grudging respect, not reluctant approval, absolute unconditional recognition. You saved him, Micah said. Help me move him to the bed, Eliza replied. This is not over. For 4 days, the blizzard raged outside and the fever raged within Josiah Hartwell. The infection set in quick and hot. Eliza barely slept. She placed cool cloths on his burning forehead, forced willow bark tea past his chapped lips, applied poultices of yarrow, and dried echinacea moss she found in his supplies. She learned the rhythm of his fever, the peaks that made him thrash and mutter, and the valleys where he lay terrifyingly still, and she rode that rhythm like a woman steering a boat through rapids, moment by moment, refusing to let the current pull him under. In his delirium, the stoic mountain man spoke. Fragments of memory tumbled out of him like stones dislodged from a dam. He spoke of the Civil War. Blood at Shiloh, boys screaming in the mud, smoke that blotted out the sky. He spoke of his father Angus. I will hold the ridge, Pa. I promised. And he spoke of Morning Star. Do not go. Do not leave me here. I cannot do this alone. Eliza listened to every word, and each one carved a deeper understanding of the man she had married. He was not cold. He was not hard. He was hollowed out. He had built walls because every person he had ever loved had been taken from him. Mother, father, lover, child, and the only way he knew to survive the losing was to stop loving altogether. Until a woman with cornflower blue eyes and a stubborn jaw had walked into his cabin with 4 children and made that impossible. The household transformed during the crisis. Caleb took over the heavy outdoor chores without being asked, hauling wood tending. Belle braving the cold with the grim determination of a boy becoming a man. Micah became the silent pillar, patrolling running trap lines alone, checking on Josiah twice daily, with a face that revealed nothing and a hand that lingered on his brother's shoulder a moment longer than necessary. Levi held the emotional center, cooking badly, keeping the children fed and occupied, telling ridiculous stories that made Jonah laugh and Rosalie forget for a few minutes the gravity of what was happening in the next room. And little Jonah sat by Josiah's bed for hours holding the carved wooden horse, talking quietly to the unconscious giant. He told him about the snowflakes and the ravens and Belle the mule. You have got to wake up, giant, Jonah said. Levi's cooking is real bad. On the morning of the 5th day, the wind died. Sunlight streamed through the frosted window panes so bright it was blinding. The blizzard had passed. Eliza was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her head resting on her arms near Josiah's hip. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins, spilling across the quilt in a cascade of gold. Even in sleep, her face showed the toll. Dark circles, a cut on her lower lip where she had bitten it during the stitching. She woke to the feeling of a large, rough hand resting on her hair, not pulling, not grabbing, just resting there gentle as snowfall, as if confirming she was real. She sat up with a whap-beam. Josiah was awake. The fever flush was gone. His eyes were clear, storm gray but softer than she had ever seen them. You stayed, he whispered. Of course I stayed, Eliza replied, wiping a tear from her cheek before she could stop it. Where would I go? Most would have let the mountain take me, he said. You saved my family first, she answered. And for the first time, the space between them did not feel like a wall. It felt like a foundation. The winter of 1878 broke in late April. The snow surrendered to the relentless sun, and the mountain came alive with meltwater and bird song and the violent green of new growth. Josiah recovered with stubborn resilience, walking with a pronounced limp and leaning on a carved hickory cane, but his strength returned, and with it something that had been absent for 7 years. Warmth. They sat together on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun paint the peaks in gold. Their shoulders touched. Neither moved away. He taught her to handle the Winchester with patient hands and quiet corrections, and every point of contact was a conversation neither of them was ready to have with words. She caught him watching her, sometimes a quiet intensity in his storm gray eyes that made her breath stop. He did not look away anymore, but the mountain could only protect them for so long. The heavy thud of hooves shattered the peace on a Tuesday afternoon. Caleb shouted from the ridge, Riders coming up the trail, 2 of them. All 3 brothers emerged. Josiah from the cabin, hand on the colt at his hip. Micah from the barn, Winchester unslung. Levi from the corral, twin colts ready. The formation was instant, instinctive, and lethal. Deputy Wade Pryor and Mayor Cornelius Sloan rode up to the edge of the yard. Pryor kept his hand near his holster, eyes darting between the 3 mountain men with naked fear. Sloan smiled his greasy smile and produced a folded piece of heavy parchment. A federal marshal, Sloan explained, had connected William Whitfield to the robbery of a Union Pacific payroll stage near South Pass 3 years ago. $4,000 stolen. An accomplice had confessed before hanging and named William. The money Sloan believed was still in Eliza's possession. "You are lying," Eliza said, stepping past Josiah. "My father was a coward, but he was not an outlaw. If he had $4,000, do you think I would have been scrubbing saloon floors on my hands and knees?" Sloan's eyes narrowed. "I have a warrant from a federal judge, Mrs. Hartwell. I have the right to search this property and to detain you for questioning." Three gun hammers cocked simultaneously. The sound echoed off the cliffs like a crack of thunder. Josiah spoke in a voice that had dropped to a register that promised violence. "You come up my mountain with a piece of paper you bought from a crooked judge in Cheyenne threatening my wife. You think there is stolen money here, Sloan? Or are you just furious that I took your cheap labor away and made a fool of you in your own town hall?" Pryor's hand trembled on his half-drawn revolver. Levi's grin was gone, replaced by something cold and predatory. "Finish drawing that iron, deputy. Please." Sloan paled. He backed toward his horse with his hands raised. "This is a mistake, Josiah. You are harboring a federal fugitive. I will bring the cavalry if I have to." "Let them come." They watched Sloan and Pryor ride down the trail and disappear into the pines. Micah spoke first. "He is not going to Fort Washakie. He cannot risk the federal government poking around his affairs." "Then what is he bringing?" Eliza asked. "Hired guns," Micah said. "Men who do not ask questions and do not leave witnesses." 2 days later, the answer to everything was found in the false bottom of a dead man's trunk. Caleb was organizing supplies when he noticed it. "Eliza, this trunk is shallow. The inside does not match the outside." He pressed his hands against the bottom panel. It sounded hollow. Josiah knelt and slid his hunting knife into the seam. The false cedar bottom gave way with a loud crack, revealing a hidden compartment lined with oilcloth. Inside lay thick, tightly bound stacks of crisp banknotes stamped with the insignia of the Union Pacific Railroad. And resting atop the stolen fortune, a leather-bound ledger and a sealed envelope bearing Eliza's name in her father's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she broke the wax seal and read, "Eliza, if you are reading this, I am dead. And Cornelius Sloan is to blame. I was weak. Sloan planned the South Pass robbery. He needed capital to keep his bank from going under. He hired the road agents and forced me to hold the money, threatening to harm you and the children if I breathed a word. He took the gold. He left me the traceable bonds. My medicine, the tonic he sells me, it is making me worse. I think he is poisoning me. Take this money. Take the ledger. Give it to the Pinkertons. And forgive me. I was never the father you deserved." Tears of pure, blinding rage spilled over Eliza's cheeks. Her father had not just been a failure. He had been a victim. A puppet. A murder victim. And Sloan, the man who had stood on the dais and condemned her siblings to indentured servitude, was the true architect of every single moment of suffering her family had endured. Micah flipped through the ledger with methodical precision. His amber eyes widened, which from Micah was the equivalent of screaming. "This implicates half the town council, Sloan, Pryor, the judge. This is not a scheme. This is an empire." "He is not bringing the cavalry," Josiah said, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "He cannot risk anyone seeing what is in this box. He is bringing hired guns who will burn this cabin to ash and tell the world the mountain man and his fugitive bride went mad." Eliza looked at the Winchester in her hands. The fear was gone, burned to nothing by the revelation of Sloan's treachery. She looked at her siblings in the loft, then at Josiah, then at Micah and Levi, 3 men who had risked everything for a family they did not even know. "Then we send them to hell," Eliza said, her voice steady and cold. Josiah stepped forward and cupped her face in his calloused hands. He leaned down and kissed her. It was their first kiss, not gentle, not tentative, desperate and fierce and tasting of gunpowder and the end of the world. A promise forged in fire. When he pulled away, Levi cleared his throat. "Well, about time. I am." Even Micah's mouth twitched. "If I fall," Josiah whispered, his gray eyes burning into hers, "you take the children down the north face. Micah knows the trail. You ride for Cheyenne and you give that ledger to the territorial governor." "You are not going to fall," Eliza said fiercely, gripping his wrists. "You swore to protect us. You are not allowed to leave me, Josiah Hartwell." He kissed her forehead. Then he chambered a round in his Sharps rifle. "Get to the loft, Caleb. Keep your sisters and brother behind the chimney stone." He looked through a crack in the shutters. Shadows moved along the tree line. 5 riders spread in a loose line. "They are here." The first sign of the attack was not a gunshot. It was the smell of burning pitch. Twilight had settled over Hartwell Ridge like a bruise, casting the homestead in deep shadows that turned every tree into a sentinel and every rock into a crouching figure. The spring thaw had left the ground soft and the air heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine resin. But now a new smell cut through it all. Rid. Chemical. The unmistakable stench of oil-soaked rags set to flame. A flaming arrow arced out of the tree line and slammed into the heavy timber of the porch roof. It hissed against the damp cedar, caught, flickered, and began to spread with the slow determination of something that intended to consume. 5 riders, Micah called from the east window, his voice clinical, the voice of a man reading terrain the way other men read scripture. Spread out along the tree line in a loose skirmish line. Pryor's on the left flank behind the big spruce. Sloan is hanging back in the pines 50 yards behind his men. Smart. He is letting the hired guns do the dying. Before Eliza could respond, the world exploded. A volley of rifle fire rained down on the cabin, shattering the upper windows and thudding into the thick cedar logs with the sound of fists striking a heavy door. Wood splinters flew through the air like shrapnel. In the loft, Rosalie screamed. Caleb pulled her behind the chimney stone, shielding Grace and Jonah with his own body, the loaded Navy Colt clutched in his right hand with the steady grip that Micah had taught him. The Hartwell brothers responded with devastating, coordinated precision, 3 men moving as a single organism, each one occupying his position and his role with the certainty of soldiers who had trained for this their entire lives, even if the training had come from trapping wolves and surviving blizzards, rather than from any military academy. Josiah sighted his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle through the narrow gap in the window barricade. He took a slow, measured breath, the way a man breathes when he knows that the next 3 seconds will decide whether he lives or dies. He held that breath at the top, let the world go still, and squeezed the trigger. The Sharps roared. It was not the crack of a rifle. It was the voice of a cannon, a concussive blast that shook dust from the rafters and rattled the oil lamps in their brackets. 200 yards away, a man in a long duster who had been sprinting from a spruce tree toward the spring house was lifted off his feet and thrown backward as if swatted by the hand of God. He landed in the mud and did not move again. 1 down. Josiah grunted, already reloading the single-shot beast with practiced speed, his massive hands moving through the familiar choreography of breech cartridge close cock. Micah worked the east window with surgical patience. He did not fire at movement. He did not fire at shadows. He waited. A muzzle flash bloomed from behind a granite boulder, revealing a shooter's position like a lighthouse revealing a ship. Micah's Winchester barked once. The bullet found its mark. A howl of pain erupted from behind the rock, and the muzzle flash did not appear again. Levi covered the western approach with his twin Colts, snapping off rapid shots at anything that moved in the timber. He was less precise than his brothers at this range, but precision was not his purpose. His purpose was suppression, keeping heads down, preventing anyone from advancing on the cabin's vulnerable western wall where the woodshed connected to the main structure. And then Levi heard it, a scraping sound at the back door. Someone had circled through the timber and was trying to breach the rear of the cabin, the wall closest to the loft where the children were huddled. Levi moved without hesitation. He crossed the cabin in 4 strides, pressed his back against the wall beside the rear door, and waited with the patience his eldest brother would have been proud of. The latch rattled. The door began to inch open. A hand appeared holding a revolver. Levi grabbed the wrist, wrenched the arm forward, and fired both Colts into the door frame at point-blank range. The intruder screamed and fell backward into the mud. Levi slammed the door shut, threw the bolt, and returned to his window without a word. His face, usually warm and animated, was carved from the same granite as the mountains. The man who told jokes and carved wooden animals had vanished. In his place stood a man who would kill, without hesitation, to protect the family sleeping in the room above his head. "Burn them out," a voice bellowed from the darkness. Deputy Wade Pryor, his courage inflated by distance and the cover of darkness. "Throw the torches." 2 men broke from the tree line, sprinting toward the cabin, with flaming pitch pine torches held high. They ran in a zigzag pattern, trying to make themselves difficult targets in the shifting firelight. Josiah dropped the first man with a shot to the chest, the Sharps roaring its terrible song, but the second man was faster. He hurled his torch onto the roof of the woodshed before Levi's bullet caught him in the leg and sent him tumbling into the dirt. The flames caught quickly on the dry wood of the shed roof. Within seconds, the fire was climbing, illuminating the entire yard in a hellish, dancing orange light that turned the homestead into a stage and the combatants into actors in a play written by the devil himself. If that fire reaches the barn, we lose Belle and the feed, Micah said, stating the tactical reality with the same calm he would use to describe weather. And if it spreads to the main cabin, we are done. Josiah made a decision. He drew his Colt revolver, kicked open the heavy front door, and charged out onto the porch. He was a terrifying sight. A massive bearded giant outlined against the flames, roaring a battle cry that echoed off the granite peaks and rolled down the mountain like thunder. He fired the Colt with devastating accuracy, dropping the crawling wounded man and driving the remaining shooters deeper into the timber. For a moment, he was the only thing standing between the fire and his family, a single man against the darkness, and the darkness flinched. But the maneuver had exposed his back. From the shadows of the pine trees on the far left flank, Deputy Wade Pryor stepped out. He raised his rifle. He had a clean, unobstructed shot at the center of Josiah Hartwell's spine. 20 yards. Even a mediocre shot could not miss at 20 yards. Pryor was a coward, but he could shoot. His finger tightened on the trigger. Pryor! Eliza's scream split the night. She thrust the barrel of her Winchester through the open doorway, did not bother to aim down the sights because there was no time at all, and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck Wade Pryor in the shoulder. The impact spun him like a top, wrenching the rifle from his hands and sending it clattering against the rocks. He howled a high, thin sound like a wounded dog and scrambled back into the brush on his hands and knees, bleeding and broken. Josiah whipped around. He saw Eliza standing in the doorway, smoke curling from the Winchester barrel, her face streaked with soot and tears, and something that looked very much like the wrath of God. Their eyes met across the burning yard. Something passed between them in that moment that neither of them would ever be able to put into words, because some things exist beyond the reach of language, in the territory where love and war and survival all collapse into the same desperate, beautiful thing. Micah and Levi rushed out with buckets from the kitchen, shoveling dirt and throwing water. Caleb appeared from the loft, unbidden, carrying a bucket in each hand. Together, they beat the fire back from the woodshed roof inch by inch, bucket by bucket, until the flames surrendered and the embers hissed into darkness. Then from the ridge above, a voice boomed through the night that belonged to none of them. Throw down your weapons in the name of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and the United States government. 3 riders crested the high ridge silhouetted against the rising moon and the fading glow of the woodshed fire. At the lead was a lean, sharp-eyed man in a bowler hat holding a double-barreled shotgun with the easy confidence of someone who had pointed it at men before and was entirely comfortable doing so again. He was flanked by 2 armed United States Marshals whose badges caught the moonlight and threw it back in sharp silver flashes. Amos Brennan, the man who had signed the boarding house register in Bitter Creek weeks ago and then disappeared into the landscape like a stone sinking into still water. He had not disappeared at all. He had been watching, following, building a case with the meticulous patience of a man who understood that justice was not a sprint, but a long, grinding march. Cornelius Sloan, seeing his hired guns dead or fleeing, broke from the tree line on his black gelding and spurred the animal frantically toward the southern trail. Brennan did not waste breath on a warning. He fired a blast from the shotgun over the fleeing mayor's head, close enough to part his hair, while one of the marshals took careful aim and shot the horse out from under him. Sloan tumbled into the dirt screaming as he rolled through the mud and brushed his immaculate wool suit torn and filthy, his wire-rimmed spectacles hanging from one ear. He lay in the muck, whimpering. And the man who had sat behind his desk in the Bitter Creek Town Hall, dispensing other people's fates like a god distributing punishments, looked for the first time exactly like what he was. A small, desperate criminal who had run out of room to run. Josiah stood on the porch chest, heaving the Colt, still smoking in his hand. The yard fell silent, save for the crackling of dying embers and the ragged breathing of men who had just survived something that should have killed them. Brennan rode down into the yard dismounted and tipped his hat to Josiah with the calm courtesy of a man conducting routine business. "You Josiah Hartwell." "I am. Been tracking Cornelius Sloan for 6 months," Brennan said, pulling off his riding gloves finger by finger. "Knew he was laundering Union Pacific money through his bank. could not prove where he hid the original bonds. When he rode out of Bitter Creek 3 days ago, with a posse of known outlaws, I figured I would follow and see what he was so desperate to kill for. He made it real easy tonight. Eliza stepped out onto the porch. Her navy dress was ruined. Her face was black with powder smoke and streaked with the tracks of dried tears. Her hands wrapped around the Winchester were still trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline, but her voice was steady as stone. He came for this, Mr. Brennan. She handed the Pinkerton operative the leather folio containing the Union Pacific bonds and her father's ledger. My father was his victim, not his accomplice. Sloan forced him to hold the bonds poisoned to him to keep him silent, and then tried to steal my family to cover his tracks. It is all in the ledger. Every transaction, every bribe, every name. Brennan whistled low as he flipped through the pages, his sharp eyes scanning columns of figures and names that would unravel an empire. Mrs. Hartwell, he said, looking at her with the kind of respect that men like Brennan reserved for people who had genuinely earned it. You just handed me the rope to hang the most corrupt man in the Wyoming Territory. The marshals hauled Sloan to his feet in irons. Pryor was dragged from the brush, bleeding from the shoulder, whimpering for mercy that no one in the yard was inclined to offer. The surviving hired gun threw his rifle to the ground and raised his hands without being asked, his appetite for other people's fights thoroughly extinguished. The Union Pacific has a standing reward for the recovery of these bonds, Brennan said, turning back to Eliza. $2,000? I reckon it belongs to you. Eliza looked at the money. Then she looked at her family. Josiah at the porch rail, his massive frame battered but unbroken. Micah leaning against the barn wall, cleaning his Winchester with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. Levi sitting on the water trough with his Colts, holstered the grin, slowly returning to his face as the adrenaline faded. Caleb standing in the cabin doorway, the Navy Colt still in his hand, looking older than any 12-year-old should ever have to look. And in the loft behind him, the sound of Rosalie singing softly to Jonah and Grace, a lullaby that floated through the shattered windows and settled over the yard like a blanket. Eliza took Josiah's hand and laced her fingers through his. Keep the reward, Josiah said, looking down at his wife. My family has everything we need. Eliza squeezed his hand. Put it toward a fund for frontier children. She told Brennan, orphans and indentured workers. There should never be another town hall like the one I stood in. Brennan tipped his hat one final time. I will see to it personally, Mrs. Hartwell. The trial of Cornelius Sloan took place in a federal courtroom in Cheyenne 6 weeks later. It lasted 6 days and made every territorial newspaper from Denver to Boise. The ledger's revelations unraveled like a pulled thread. Half the Bitter Creek Town Council was implicated. Deputy Pryor, facing 20 years, turned state's evidence and confirmed every detail in William Whitfield's letter, including the poisoning. An analysis of William's tonic revealed dangerous levels of arsenic. The man had not died of consumption. He had been murdered slowly and deliberately by the man who called himself his creditor. Eliza was called to testify. She traveled down the mountain for the first time since her wedding day, flanked by all 3 Hartwell brothers in their finest clothes. She sat in the witness chair and spoke with the quiet composure of a woman who had survived worse than a courtroom. She described her father's illness, the suspicious tonic, the escalating debts in the town hall proceeding where her siblings had nearly been sold. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply told the truth, and the truth was more devastating than any theatrics could have been. Sloan was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. As he was led from the courtroom, he locked eyes with Eliza for a single second. She held his gaze with those cornflower blue eyes, steady and unblinking, until he looked away. She did not flinch. She did not gloat. She simply let him see the woman he had tried to destroy and failed. Bitter Creek reformed under new leadership. The school teacher, Miss Dawes, one of the few who had shown Eliza kindness during those desperate months of survival, was elected to the new town council. Mrs. Hargrove, mortified by her association with Sloan's regime, retreated into a permanent social obscurity from which she never emerged. On the mountain, the seasons turned, and the homestead entered a new era. One evening after the trial, after the last echoes of gunfire had faded from the granite walls of Hartwell Ridge, Eliza sat by the dying fire with Josiah. The children were asleep. Mike and Levi had retired to their quarters. The cabin was quiet in the way that only a mountain cabin can be quiet, wrapped in the vast, breathing silence of the wilderness. Eliza reached for Josiah's hand. She stood. He stood. Their eyes met in the firelight, and everything that needed to be said had already been said by months of shared survival, by blood and stitches, and whispered confessions, by a carved boxwood comb, and a hand resting gently on golden hair. She led him to the door of the main room. The door closed softly behind them. When morning came, the light streaming through the frosted window fell on two people whose lives had been irrevocably joined not by a 4-minute ceremony in a dusty town hall, but by the accumulation of 1,000 small acts of courage and care that had over time become indistinguishable from love. The look they shared across the breakfast table that morning said everything. Levi noticed and grinned into his coffee cup. Micah noticed and said nothing, which was his way of saying everything. A few days later, Josiah led Eliza up the eastern ridge to the big pine tree. Beneath its spreading branches, 2 stones marked the resting place of Morning Star and the child who had never drawn breath. Josiah placed a wildflower on each stone. His jaw was tight. His eyes were clear. "She would have liked you," he said quietly. Eliza knelt beside the graves. She placed her own flower next to his. "Thank you," she whispered to the woman beneath the stones, "for teaching him how to love." They stood together, hand in hand. They walked back down the ridge without looking back because there was nothing behind them but honored memory, and everything ahead of them was alive. The cabin expanded that summer, a second bedroom, a schoolroom, because Eliza insisted that the children would read and write and cipher, and she would not raise illiterate mountain folk no matter how magnificent the mountains were. A larger kitchen, a new barn bigger and stronger than the old one built by 3 brothers and a 12-year-old boy who swung a hammer like he had been born to it. The following winter, Eliza gave birth to a son. Josiah paced outside the bedroom door with his massive hands clenched at his sides, his face drained of color, looking less like a man who had survived Shiloh and more like a man facing something far more terrifying than any battlefield. When the baby's cry pierced the silence, Josiah Hartwell, who had not wept in 7 years, walked through the door and wept. Eliza placed the baby in his arms, a boy, gray eyes like his father. "Angus," she said softly, "after his grandfather." And on the carved cedar cradle that Josiah had built years ago for a child who never came, a new life slept beneath the same quilts, breathing the same mountain air, beginning a story that his father had nearly given up hope of ever telling. The years turned. The seasons cycled. The homestead grew from a single cabin into something that looked from the high ridge at sunset like a small village nestled against the granite face of the mountain. Caleb grew into a man under Micah's quiet tutelage. On the day he tracked and brought down his first buck alone, a clean shot at 200 yards that dropped the animal without suffering, Micah walked over, drew his own skinning knife, the knife his father Angus had given him, and held it out. "This was my father's. Now it is yours." Caleb's eyes filled. He took the knife with both hands. "Thank you, brother." Micah turned and walked back toward the homestead, and if his own eyes were brighter than usual, the mountain wind took the blame. Levi married at 40. A school teacher from Cheyenne named Margaret, the only woman alive with enough humor and enough iron in her spine to hold Levi Hartwell in one place. They had 2 children and lived in the cabin on the South Ridge that Levi expanded with his own hands. His laughter still echoed off the peaks every evening, and Margaret told anyone who would listen that she had married one man and gotten an entire civilization in the bargain. By the time another decade had passed, the children Eliza had carried out of the Bitter Creek Town Hall on a desperate autumn afternoon had grown into people who carried the mountain inside them wherever they went. Rosalie became an artist. Her paintings of the Wind River Range hung in galleries in Cheyenne and Denver, capturing light and shadow and the particular quality of silence that exists only above the timberline. She married a university professor who was thoroughly terrified of her 3 enormous uncles and never entirely stopped being so. Jonah grew into the mirror image of Josiah, tall and broad and quiet with the same storm gray eyes and the same economy of words. He ran the northern trap lines with Micah and still called Josiah Giant, a title that had evolved from a child's nickname into the highest form of respect he knew how to give. Grace became a teacher. She taught in the new schoolhouse in Bitter Creek, a building constructed on the very ground where the old town hall had stood. The town hall where 25 years earlier her family had nearly been torn apart. She did not remember that day. She had been 11 months old, asleep on her sister's chest, But she knew the story, and every morning when she walked through her classroom door, she thought, this is what justice looks like. Not vengeance, not punishment, just a woman teaching children to read in a room that used to sell them. And young Angus Josiah and Eliza's son built his own cabin on the western slope with cedar logs cut and hewn by his own hands, using the techniques his father taught him, the same techniques his grandfather Angus had brought from Scotland to the American wilderness 2 generations before. 25 years after a gavel cracked in a dusty town hall and a young woman's world ended, the Hartwell homestead sat on its granite plateau like something that had always been there and always would be. 4 cabins now scattered across the ridge, a large barn, a schoolroom, a garden that produced enough vegetables to feed the extended family through the winter, a corral full of horses and mules. And on the wide porch of the main cabin, the original cabin, the one Angus Hartwell had built with his bare hands and his 3 sons had defended with their lives, 2 rocking chairs sat side by side, worn smooth by years of use. It was an autumn evening. The sun was setting behind the Wind River peaks, painting the sky in the same violent streaks of purple and bruised red that had colored the evening Eliza first arrived on this mountain, trembling and terrified, clutching a baby to her chest, and praying she had not made the worst mistake of her life. Josiah Hartwell sat in the left rocking chair. He was 58 years old. His beard was white. The scar on his cheek had faded to a thin silver line. He walked with a cane on cold days when the old wolf wound ached in his hip, but his eyes were the same, storm gray, clear and sharp as the day he had walked into the Bitter Creek Town Hall and poured gold on a corrupt man's desk. Eliza sat beside him, 47 years old. Her honey blonde hair was threaded with silver, now pulled back in the same style her mother had worn. Her hands, once soft and blistered from laundering saloon shirts, were strong and calloused from a quarter-century of mountain living. But her eyes were the same too. Cornflower blue, bright with intelligence, and still capable of stopping Josiah Hartwell in his tracks with a single look. From inside the cabin came the sounds of family. Levi's laughter still booming, still irrepressible. The clatter of plates being set on the big table by hands that belonged to grandchildren who had never known a world without this mountain. Micah's voice, rare and therefore precious, correcting a grandchild's grip on a whittling knife. The smell of venison stew drifting through the open door, the same recipe Eliza had made on her first night in this cabin, the recipe that had softened 3 mountain men and began the slow, irreversible process of turning a house into a home. Outside, grandchildren chased each other through the wildflowers that grew in the meadow between the cabins. Their laughter rang off the granite walls and floated up toward the peaks, mixing with our cry of hawks and the whisper of wind through ancient pines. Eliza reached over and took Josiah's hand. His massive fingers closed around hers gently, the way they always had, as if she were made of something precious that he could not quite believe he had been allowed to hold. "Do you remember the first time you saw this place?" Josiah asked. His voice was slower now, deeper with age, but it still carried the same quiet authority that had silenced a room full of people 25 years ago. "I expected a shack," Eliza said, smiling. "I expected to spend the winter in a dirt floor hovel with 3 strangers who smelled like bear grease." "We did smell like bear grease. You smelled like pine trees and wood smoke and something I could not name," she said. "It took me months to figure out what it was." "What was it?" "Home," she said. "You smelled like home. I just did not know it yet." They rocked in silence for a while, watching the sun slide behind the mountains. The same mountains that had tested them with blizzards and wolves and fever. The same mountains that had sheltered them from corrupt men with guns and torches. The same mountains that had watched patient and eternal as 2 strangers became partners, became lovers, became the foundation of something that would outlast them both. Earlier that week, on their way down the mountain for Grace's wedding, Eliza had asked Josiah to stop the wagon at the Bitter Creek Cemetery. She had walked alone to her father's grave, a weathered stone covered in lichen, and placed a wildflower on the earth. "I found the letter, Papa," she said quietly. "I understand now. You were not strong, but you tried to protect us the only way you knew how, and I forgive you." She paused. The wind carried the smell of autumn grass, and the 3 men on the mountain that you will never meet. They are my family now. They taught me that love is not words or promises. Love is standing in the middle of a blizzard for someone else. Love is chopping wood every morning without needing to be thanked. Love is 25 years and still counting. Josiah had stood behind her close enough that she knew he was there far enough to give her the privacy of grief. She turned, took his hand, and they walked back to the wagon without looking behind them. Now on the porch, the last light of day turning the western sky to gold, Eliza leaned her head against Josiah's shoulder. It was a gesture worn smooth by 25 years of repetition, as natural as breathing, as essential as the heartbeat beneath the flannel shirt. She pressed her ear against. Josiah, do you remember what you said in the town hall? The first words you spoke? How much, he said. 2 words, she said, 2 words and a bag of gold, and you changed everything. I did not change anything, Josiah said quietly. I just opened a door. You are the one who walked through it. From inside the cabin, Levi's voice called out, are you two going to sit out there being romantic all night, or are you coming in for supper? Micah is trying to teach your grandson to skin a rabbit at the dinner table, and Margaret is about to murder him. Eliza laughed. It was the same laugh that had surprised her in this cabin 25 years ago, the laugh she had not heard from her own lips in over a year, the laugh that had made Josiah look at her with that quiet, fierce intensity and let her see for the first time what lived behind the granite. She still caught him looking at her that way sometimes, after all these years, after all the winters. Josiah stood slowly leaning on the hickory cane. He offered his hand. She took it and rose, and they stood together on the porch for one more moment, looking out over the land they had built with their own hands. The cabins glowing warm in the dusk, the barn standing solid against the ridge, the garden, the corral, the children, the grandchildren, the whole impossible beautiful life that had grown from a desperate bargain in a dusty town hall a quarter-century ago. She still remembered stepping off that stagecoach into nothing, remembered the gavel, remembered the 3 shadows filling the doorway, massive and terrifying, and smelling of pine and possibility. Remembered the deep, scraping voice that spoke 2 words and tore her future out of the hands of a man who would have sold it for $200. 25 years later, standing on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers as the sun painted the Wind River peaks in gold, she thought that was the day my life began. Some things like the mountain are immovable, fierce, and entirely permanently unconditionally yours. Love is one of them.